The silence in the Galactic Council chamber was deafening. For the first time in 3 centuries, the constant hum of alien chatter had stopped. Ambassador Jake Morrison stood at the podium, his weathered hands gripping the edges as he surveyed the sea of non-human faces before him. Each species represented here had grown fat and comfortable on humanity's endless patience. But patience, Jake knew, was not weakness. It was a choice. The chamber itself was a monument to cosmic arrogance. Towering crystalline walls displayed the achievements of 1,000 worlds. While Earth's contributions were relegated to a tiny corner marked primitive cultures, the seating arrangement told the real story humans relegated to the back rows. Behind species that had barely discovered fire when humanity was already reaching for the stars. "Honored delegates," Jake began, his voice carrying across the vast chamber with the weight of accumulated frustration. The Terran Federation has filed 847 formal complaints regarding discriminatory practices against human colonies and territories. A low rumble of dismissive sounds rippled through the assembly. The blue-skinned Altarians made their clicking sounds of amusement. The gas-dwelling Nebulans puffed their contempt through their breathing apparatus. But it was the reptilian Voss delegate who broke the pretense of diplomatic courtesy. 800 complaints? Counselor Vex hissed, his forked tongue flicking out in what passed for laughter among his species. Perhaps if the Deathworlders spent less time whining and more time evolving past their violent nature, they wouldn't need to file so many grievances. The chamber erupted in what could generously be called laughter, species that had never set foot on a world more dangerous than a botanical garden, found endless amusement in mocking the humans who had crawled out of Earth's hellish environment. Jake waited. He had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable, 300 years of diplomatic humiliation. 300 years of watching human colonies get the worst trade deals, the most dangerous assignments, the least representation. 300 years of being treated like dangerous animals that should be grateful for the scraps thrown their way? "You find our concerns amusing?" Jake said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the chamber. "Tell me, Counselor Vex, how many of your species have died exploring the void sectors we've been assigned?" The laughter began to fade. The void sectors were notorious death traps regions of space, so dangerous that most species refused to even send probes. Yet humans had been systematically assigned to map and colonize these areas for decades. How many Altarian colonies have survived Category 5 solar storms? Jake continued, his gaze sweeping across the blue-skinned delegates. How many Nebulan settlements have thrived on worlds where the atmosphere itself is toxic? The chamber was growing quieter now. These species had volunteered for none of the dangerous missions that humans routinely accepted without complaint. "But here's the thing that really gets me," Jake said, and for the first time, something like humor crept into his voice. "You keep calling us Deathworlders like it's an insult. Do you know what we call ourselves?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "Survivors." The word hit the chamber like a physical blow. Every species present suddenly remembered why. Their ancestors had developed flight responses. Why their instincts screamed danger when cornered. Why their nightmares were filled with predators. "For 3 centuries, Jake continued, his voice building now, "we've played by your rules. We've accepted your trade restrictions that force us to sell our resources at 10% below market value. We've smiled politely when you assigned us to explore the most dangerous regions of space. We've even thanked you for the privilege of dying in wars that weren't our fights." The massive view screen behind Jake flickered to life, showing casualty reports from the last 50 years. Human names scrolled endlessly: miners who died extracting rare minerals from unstable planets, explorers who vanished mapping hostile systems, soldiers who fell protecting colonies that weren't even their own. "But here's what you never understood," Jake said, his voice now carrying an edge that made even the most arrogant delegates shift uncomfortably. "We weren't being weak. We were being nice." The Voss delegates' reptilian features twisted into what might have been confusion. "What will the Deathworlders do now? Cry to their primitive governments? Threaten us with your crude weapons?" Jake's expression changed. The diplomatic mask he'd worn for decades simply vanished, revealing something that made every survival instinct in the chamber scream warnings. It wasn't anger. Anger was hot and messy and predictable. This was something far more dangerous. It was the cold, calculating expression of an apex predator that had finally decided to stop pretending to be prey. "No, counselor," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll simply stop pretending. To be civilized." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 10 degrees. Species that had never known real fear suddenly understood why their ancestors had developed the ability to recognize danger. Every delegate present felt the same primal terror that had once sent their evolutionary predecessors fleeing from predators. "In the night, you see," Jake continued, his tone conversational now, almost friendly, "you've made a fundamental error in your calculations. You assumed that because we've been patient, we're weak. Because we've been diplomatic, we're helpless. Because we've been nice, we're harmless." He stepped closer to the podium, and somehow the movement seemed to make him tower over the entire assembly, despite being just one human among thousands of aliens. "Let me clarify something for you," Jake said. "Humans don't come from a nice world. We come from a world that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years. We survived ice ages, supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, plague predators, and each other. We didn't evolve to be nice. We evolved to be the most dangerous thing on a planet full of dangerous things." The chamber was dead silent now. Even the life support systems seemed to have quieted, as if the station itself was holding its breath. "The only reason you're all still alive," Jake continued, "is because we chose to be better than our nature. We chose cooperation over domination. We chose diplomacy over destruction. We chose to be the civilization we wanted to meet among the stars." He paused, letting that sink in. "But you've made it clear that civilization isn't valued here. You've made it clear that nice is seen as weakness. You've made it clear that the only thing you understand is power." Jake turned to leave, then stopped at the chamber's exit. When he looked back, every delegate in the room felt like prey being evaluated by a predator. "You have 72 hours to reconsider your position on human rights and representation," he said. "After that, we'll stop being the humans you think, and start being the humans you should have feared." His footsteps echoed in the silence as he walked away, each step sounding like a countdown. Timer ticking toward something terrible. The chamber remained silent for nearly 10 minutes after he left. Finally, the Altarian delegate spoke in a voice, barely above a whisper. "Did we just declare war on the species that colonized the void sectors for fun?" No one answered. They all knew the answer. The countdown to humanity's true nature had begun, and just like the power of compounding that turns small, consistent actions into massive results over time, 300 years of accumulated patience was about to transform into something that would reshape the galaxy forever. The encrypted signal reached Admiral Tom Bradley while he was reviewing star charts in his command center aboard the flagship Defiance. His weathered hands moved across the holographic display, tracing patrol routes that had become routine over the past decade. The Outer Rim territories were supposed to be quite a punishment assignment for a species the galaxy considered too dangerous for important work. But Tom Bradley knew better. Nothing about humanity's presence in the Outer Rim was punishment. It was preparation. The transmission was brief, just 7 words that changed everything. Diplomacy failed. Execute Protocol Omega. Tom stared at the message for exactly 3 seconds. Then his fingers began moving across the command console with the practiced precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his nightmares. "All stations, this is Admiral Bradley," he announced over the fleet-wide communication system. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Repeat, initiate Protocol Omega." Across the bridge, his senior staff exchanged glances. They had all wondered if this day would ever come. 3 centuries of diplomatic humiliation. 3 centuries of being treated like dangerous animals that should be grateful for scraps. But they had also spent 3 centuries preparing for the moment. When talking stopped working, the response was immediate and terrifying in its coordination. Across human space, from the industrial worlds of the inner colonies to the research stations of the Outer Rim, dormant systems came online. Military commanders who had been playing the role of peacekeepers for decades suddenly revealed their true nature. Civilian administrators who had spent years filing complaints and requesting aid transformed into the strategic masterminds they had always been. But here's what the galaxy never understood about humans. They thought our preparations were paranoia. They looked at our fortress worlds and assumed we were primitive. They saw our armed civilians and called us violent. They missed the most important detail of all. We weren't preparing for war. We were preparing for the day when we would have to stop holding back. The hegemony had been planning their final solution to the human problem for months. Fleet Commander Thok stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Dominion, watching. Tactical displays that showed the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. 25,000 ships, representing the combined military might of 17 species. All united in their desire to eliminate the human threat once and for all. Intelligence reports confirm that the human fleet is scattering. His tactical officer reported, mandibles clicking with satisfaction. Their civilian populations are evacuating the outer colonies, running just as our projections indicated. Thak's multiple eyes focused on the display showing the Sol System humanity's birth world and their emotional center. The plan was simple. Destroy Earth, break human morale, then systematically eliminate the scattered survivors. Clean, efficient. Final Deathworlders always reveal their true nature when faced with superior force, Thok announced to his bridge crew. They're cowards, who only fight when they think they can win, begin the final approach to their home world. But as the massive armada moved deeper into human space, something began to feel wrong. The fleeing human vessels weren't running in panic, they were moving with purpose. Every retreat seemed calculated, every evacuation followed precise patterns. That looked almost like, "Sir," the tactical officer's voice carried a note of confusion. The human ship movements don't match standard panic protocols. They're maintaining formation integrity, even during their retreat. Thok dismissed the concern with a wave of his primary arm. Deathworlders have military training. Of course, they maintain some discipline, even in defeat. Continue the advance. First sign that something was catastrophically wrong came when they reached the edge of the Sol System. The civilian mining platforms scattered throughout the asteroid belt were powering up systems that shouldn't exist. The research stations orbiting the outer planets were activating energy signatures that made no sense for my scientific equipment. Commander? The sensor operator's voice cracked with fear. Those aren't civilian installations. They're weapons platforms. Thak's confidence wavered for the first time. Impossible. Our intelligence confirmed those were mining and research facilities. Primitive human infrastructure. Sir, the energy readings are off the charts. These aren't just weapons, they're weapons that violate several laws of physics. But the real shock came when the fleeing human ships suddenly reversed course. 25,000 hegemony vessels found themselves surrounded by barely 3,000 human ships. The numbers should have been laughably in the hegemony's favor, until the humans opened fire. The first salvo came from everywhere at once. The mining platforms revealed themselves as massive railgun arrays that fired projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. The research stations unveiled energy weapons that seemed to bend space itself. The fleeing human ships transformed into something that defied every tactical manual in the galaxy. How is this possible? Thok screamed as his flagship shuddered under impacts that shouldn't exist. They're Deathworlders. They're supposed to be primitive. His tactical officer, trying to make sense of readings that broke every known law of warfare, finally understood the horrible truth. Sir, they weren't building defenses. They were building an execution chamber. The humans hadn't been preparing for war. They had been preparing for genocide, not to commit it, but to survive it. Every civilian installation, every research project, every mining operation had been designed with one purpose: to turn any attack on humanity into a suicide mission for the attackers. You see, when you spend 3 centuries being treated like dangerous animals, you learn to think like a predator. And predators don't just fight, they hunt. They set traps. They turn their enemy's aggression against them. The hegemony had walked into the most sophisticated military trap in galactic history. 25,000 ships, representing centuries of military development and the combined might of 17 species, found themselves caught in a kill zone that had been 300 years in the making. Admiral Bradley's voice cut through. The chaos on all frequencies, Hegemony Fleet. This is Admiral Bradley of the Terran Federation. You have entered Sol System with hostile intent. You have approximately 30 minutes to surrender before we stop being polite about this. Thak's response was a burst of weapons fire that would have vaporized a normal human fleet. Instead, it simply activated more hidden defenses. The space around his flagship lit up with energy beams that seemed to bend reality itself. 30 minutes? Thak gasped as his ship's hull began to buckle. What happens in 30 minutes? Bradley's response carried the weight of 3 centuries of accumulated rage. In 30 minutes, we stop pretending this is a fair fight. The countdown had begun. And just like compound interest, 300 years of patient preparation was about to pay dividends that would reshape the galaxy forever. The galaxy was about to learn. What happened when you cornered the most dangerous predator in the universe and then gave it 3 centuries to prepare for the fight? The moment Admiral Bradley's 30-minute deadline expired, the Sol System transformed into something that would haunt the nightmares of every surviving species. For generations to come, what the hegemony had assumed was humanity's home. Sistema, simple collection of planets orbiting an ordinary star, revealed itself to be the most sophisticated weapon of mass destruction ever conceived. The first barrage didn't come from the human fleet. It came from everywhere at once. Mars, the red planet that aliens had always dismissed as a dusty wasteland, suddenly bristled with massive railgun installations that emerged from beneath its surface like the spines of an awakening beast. Each projectile fired at 20% light speed, turning simple chunks of iron into planet killers that could punch through any known shielding. But that was just the beginning. The asteroid belt, which every alien species had assumed was simply a collection of space rocks, revealed itself as the largest weapons platform in galactic history. Thousands of asteroids that had been hollowed out over centuries suddenly opened like deadly flowers, each one containing weapon systems that violated several laws of physics. "Sir, the asteroids are moving," screamed the hegemony's tactical officer, his voice cracking with terror. "They're not just weapons platforms, they're mobile weapons platforms." Commander Thak watched his tactical display in growing horrors. What he had assumed were random space rocks began coordinating their movements with military precision. Each asteroid had been fitted with propulsion systems and targeting computers, turning the entire belt into a swarm of mobile death dealers. But the real shock came from the outer planets, Jupiters, moons, which human scientists had claimed were simple research stations, suddenly revealed massive energy weapons that seemed to bend space itself. The weapons fired beams of pure gravitational force that could crush a battleship into a marble-sized ball of compressed matter. "How is this possible?" Thak whispered, watching his proud fleet being systematically disassembled by weapons that shouldn't exist. "They're supposed to be primitive Deathworlders." His science officer, struggling to make sense of readings that broke every known law of physics, finally understood the terrifying truth. "Sir, they weren't just building weapons. They were building weapons that used their own planet as ammunition." That's when the true horror began. Saturn's rings, those beautiful, delicate bands of ice and rock that had inspired poets across the galaxy, suddenly revealed themselves as the ultimate defensive weapon. Each tiny particle in the rings was actually a microscopic guided missile, capable of independent flight and targeting. Trillions of these micromissiles swarmed toward the hegemony fleet like a cloud of mechanical locusts. Impossible. Thak screamed as his flagship's hull began to buckle under the impact of billions of tiny projectiles. How can they control so many individual weapons? The answer came from Admiral Bradley himself, his voice cutting through the chaos on all communication frequencies. "For 3 centuries, we begged for peace. We held back our true nature. We pretended you were civilized enough to deserve mercy. The hegemony flagship, eternal conqueror. shuddered under impacts from weapons that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics with each shot. Thok watched his fleet disintegrate around him, 30 years of military supremacy crumbling in 30 minutes of absolute warfare. But here's what you never understood, Bradley continued, his voice now carrying across every communication channel in the galaxy. We weren't holding back because we were weak. We were holding back because we were terrified of what we might become. Pluto, the tiny, distant planet that most species had forgotten existed, suddenly revealed itself as the control center for the entire system. Hidden deep beneath its frozen surface, quantum computers that had been calculating, targeting solutions, for centuries suddenly came online, coordinating an attack that involved every piece of matter in the Sol system. Today, you learn why Earth is called a death world. Bradley's words echoed across the galaxy, reaching every species that had ever mocked human weakness. Today, you discover what happens when humans stop being nice. The space around the hegemony fleet became a hellscape of coordinated destruction. Comets that had been orbiting peacefully for millions of years suddenly ignited their hidden engines, transforming into guided missiles the size of mountains. Even the solar wind itself, the stream of particles constantly flowing from the sun, had been weaponized, creating electromagnetic fields that could fry the electronics of any ship caught within them. Thak's science officer, his multiple eyes, wide with terror, finally grasped the full scope of what they faced. Commander, they didn't just militarize their space. They militarized their entire solar system. Every planet, every moon, every asteroid, every particle of dust, it's all part of one massive weapon. But the most terrifying revelation came when Earth itself began to move. The blue planet, humanity's birth world, and the supposed center of their civilization suddenly revealed massive engines hidden beneath its oceans. The entire planet began to shift its orbit, positioning itself to use its own gravity as a weapon. The sight of an entire world moving with deliberate intent broke the mind of every alien witness. They turned their homeworld into a weapon, Thok whispered, his voice filled with religious terror. They turned their own planet into a weapon. The human fleet, which had seemed so small and insignificant compared to the hegemony's massive armada, now revealed its true purpose. They weren't the primary weapon, they were the coordinators. Each human ship contained quantum computers that were orchestrating the movements of trillions of individual weapon systems across the entire solar system. Sir, incoming transmission from the human fleet, the communications officer reported, his voice shaking. Put it through, Thok ordered. Though part of him already knew this would be his last command. Admiral Bradley's face appeared on the screen. And for the first time, Thok saw a human without the diplomatic mask they had worn for 3 centuries. What he saw was the face of a predator that had finally stopped pretending to be prey. Commander Thok, Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of accumulated rage, your species spent decades calling us Deathworlders. You thought it was an insult. You never realized it was a warning. The space around the Eternal Conqueror lit up with energy beams that seemed to bend reality itself. Thok felt his ship's hull beginning to buckle under forces that shouldn't exist. We come from a world that tried to kill us every single day, Bradley continued. We learned to survive ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, and predators. That would give your species nightmares. We learned to turn every challenge into a weapon, every obstacle into an advantage. Thak's last coherent thought was a question that would haunt the galaxy. If this is what they're like when they're angry, what were they like when they were trying to be nice? His final transmission was a terrified scream that reached every corner of the galaxy. They're not just Deathworlders, ... They're death incarnate. By the time the slaughter ended, the hegemony's mighty armada was nothing but glowing debris orbiting a star that had remained deceptively peaceful for far too long. The galaxy had learned a lesson that would reshape interstellar relations forever. Never threaten a species that had spent 3 centuries patiently, building the ultimate weapon while pretending to be civilized, and just like compound interest. 300 years of preparation had paid the ultimate dividend, the complete and total security of humanity's place in the galaxy. The quantum communication networks lit up like a Christmas tree on fire as news of the hegemony's complete annihilation spread across the galaxy in mere hours. 25,000 ships, the largest military force in galactic history, had been reduced to glowing space debris in less than 40 minutes. The impossible had become reality, and every species that had spent centuries mocking human weakness suddenly felt the cold grip of evolutionary terror. But here's the thing about humans. We've always been really good at multitasking. While the galaxy was still trying to process the destruction of the hegemony fleet, humanity was already moving on to the next item on their very long list of grievances. And that list, accumulated over 3 centuries of diplomatic humiliation, was about to become a cosmic reckoning. The Crystalline Collective learned this lesson first. For decades, it operated massive slave camps on human colony worlds, forcing human workers to extract rare minerals from the most dangerous mining sites in the galaxy. The Collective's reasoning was simple. Humans were tough enough to survive the work, desperate enough to accept the conditions, and weak enough to never fight back? They were right about the first 2 points, catastrophically wrong about the third. Supreme Crystalline Overlord Zix was reviewing profit reports from the human mining operations when his palace's defensive systems detected something impossible. Ships were materializing out of empty space, around every collective world simultaneously. How many vessels? Zix demanded, his crystalline form resonating with harmonic frequencies of panic. Unknown, Supreme Overlord, his tactical advisor replied, his voice cracking like breaking glass. They're not showing up on our sensors until they're already in firing position. It's like they're stepping out of folded space itself. The humans had spent 3 centuries studying every species' technology, learning their weaknesses, understanding their limitations. While the Collective had been congratulating themselves on their superior crystalline sensors, humanity had been developing stealth technology that made their ships invisible to crystalline detection methods. Incoming transmission from the human fleet, the communications officer announced. The message was simple and delivered by a human woman whose voice carried the weight of every enslaved human worker who had died in the Collective's mines. Is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Liberation Fleet. You have exactly 1 hour to release every human in your custody and surrender control of your mining operations. After that, we'll extract them ourselves. Zix's crystalline form pulsed with indignation. Extract them? With what army? We have defensive platforms around every world. Shields that can withstand any known weapon. His words were cut off as the human ships opened fire with weapons that bypassed the Collective's shields entirely. The humans had studied crystalline technology for centuries, learning that their shields were designed to stop energy weapons in kinetic projectiles. They had never considered weapons that could alter the harmonic frequencies of the crystals. Themselves, the Collective's mighty fortresses began to sing a beautiful, haunting melody that grew louder and more. It's intense, until the crystalline structures simply shattered from their own resonance. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, the Void Hunters were discovering that their favorite prey had become the ultimate predator. The Void Hunters had turned hunting humans into a sport. They would capture human vessels, strip away their weapons, and release them into asteroid fields or nebulas for the thrill of the hunt. The humans always fought back, always tried to escape, always provided excellent entertainment before their inevitable death. Hunter Prime Kresh was leading his pack through the outer rim territories when his ship's systems began behaving strangely. His targeting computers were giving conflicting readings. His weapons were powering down randomly, and his navigation systems kept trying to plot courses into nearby suns. What's happening to our systems? Kresh snarled, his predatory instincts screaming warnings. His technical specialist, a nervous creature from a species the hunters had conquered decades ago, studied the readings with growing terror. Sir, something is taking control of our technology. Our own systems are being turned against us. The humans had spent years being hunted by the Void Hunters, and during that time, they had learned something crucial. Every hunter ship contained captured human technology. Technology that still contained hidden subroutines, dormant programs, quantum backdoors that had been waiting for the right activation signal. Incoming transmission, the communications officer announced. The message came from Captain Mike Torres, a man whose brother had been killed in a Void Hunter hunting expedition 5 years earlier, Hunter Prime Kresh. This is Captain Torres of the Terran Retribution Fleet. You've been hunting humans for sport for 50 years. Today, you learn what it feels like to be the prey. Kresh's ship lurched violently as his own weapons systems turned against him. The Hunter fleet found themselves trapped in a nightmare where their own technology had become their enemy. Ship every weapon, every piece of equipment that contained even a fragment of human technology was now working against them. But the message that truly terrified every species in the galaxy wasn't the destruction of fleets or the liberation of colonies. It was the message that appeared simultaneously on every screen, every communication device, every quantum network in known space. The message appeared in every language, every form of communication, every method of information transfer that existed. It bypassed security systems, ignored encryption, and manifested itself on devices that weren't even connected to any network. We offered friendship, we offered partnership, we offered peace. Since you chose to see us as enemies, we'll show you what human enemies actually look like. The words were simple, but their implications were staggering. Humanity had somehow gained access to every communication system in the galaxy simultaneously. Every species suddenly realized that their most secure networks, their most protected systems, their most classified information had been compromised for who knew how long. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, but their chambers looked like a ghost town. The hegemony's seats were empty, their entire species had been reduced to scattered survivors. The Crystalline Collective's representatives were absent, their homeworlds were under human occupation, the Void Hunters delegation was nowhere to be found. Their fleet had simply vanished into deep space. Of the original 87 species that had formed the council, only 43 delegates showed up. The others had either been destroyed, surrendered, or simply gone silent. Council President Mordok, a being from one of the few species that had always treated humans with basic respect, called the session to order with a trembling voice. Are gathered here to address the human situation. The remaining delegates whispered among themselves, sharing the same horrifying realization that was spreading across the galaxy. Like a plague of understanding, they had never actually fought humans. They had fought humans who were holding back. For 3 centuries, humanity had been like a sleeping giant, accepting every insult, every slight, every act of discrimination, while slowly, patiently, methodically preparing for the day when patience would no longer be enough. How many of our species are left? Whispered the Altarian delegate, his blue skin pale with terror. The question isn't how many are left, replied the Centaurian representative. The question is how many they're planning to leave alive. The galaxy had awakened something that had been dormant for 300 years, something that had been building strength, accumulating resources, planning for every possible contingency, and just like compound interest, 3 centuries of accumulated preparation was about to pay dividends that would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. Forever, the age of human niceness was over. The age of human justice had begun. 6 months after the galaxy learned what human patience really meant, Ambassador Jake Morrison walked through the corridors of the Galactic Council building for the first time since delivering his 72-hour ultimatum. The hallways that had once buzzed with the arrogant chatter of species who saw humans as second-class citizens were now eerily quiet, filled only with the whispered conversations of survivors who had learned to speak in respectful tones. The transformation was remarkable. Where once alien delegates had strutted through these halls with the confidence of apex predators, now they moved with the careful deliberation of prey animals who had finally encountered something higher on the food chain. The council chamber itself told the story of the galaxy's new reality. Of the original 87 species seats, only 53 were occupied. The rest stood empty, their nameplates serving as memorials to civilizations that had learned too late that there was a difference between human patience and human weakness. The hegemony section, once the most prominent seating area, positioned to emphasize their military dominance, was now completely vacant. 25,000 ships and the military might of 17 allied species had been reduced to scattered debris and cautionary tales in less than an hour of actual combat. But here's what made the situation truly surreal. The surviving species weren't angry about their losses. They were grateful to still exist. Jake took his place at the podium, the same spot where he had delivered humanity's final diplomatic warning 6 months earlier. The chamber fell silent immediately, not the dismissive silence of species who considered humans beneath their notice, but the respectful silence of beings who had learned to listen when a human spoke. "Honored delegates," Jake began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber that had once echoed with mocking laughter at human concerns. "The Terran Federation is prepared to resume normal diplomatic relations." The relief in the chamber was palpable. Species that had spent centuries treating humans as dangerous animals, barely worthy of consideration, now hung on every word from the human ambassador. "Our requirements remain unchanged from our original diplomatic proposals," Jake continued. "Equal representation in council voting. Fair trade agreements based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Basic dignity and respect for human colonies and territories." The Altarian delegate, one of the few species that had survived the reckoning largely intact due to their neutral stance, raised a trembling hand. "Ambassador Morrison, the Altarian Republic wishes to formally apologize for our previous ... oversights. Regarding human rights, we would like to propose a new trade agreement that provides human colonies with preferential status." Jake nodded. Politely, the Terran Federation appreciates the Altarian Republic's willingness to negotiate fairly. "We look forward to productive discussions." But it was the Centaurian representative who asked the question that was on every surviving delegate's mind. "Ambassador Morrison, how do we ensure that ... that recent events don't happen again?" The chamber held its breath. Every species present had the same fear that humanity's patience might run out again, that some future slight might trigger another demonstration of what humans looked like. When they stopped being nice, Jake's expression softened slightly. For a moment, he looked like the diplomatic human who had spent 3 centuries asking politely for basic respect. "The answer is simple, Counselor. Treat us like equals. Honor your agreements. Remember that when we say please, we're not begging, we're offering you the courtesy of choosing cooperation over the alternative." The silence that followed was pregnant with understanding. Every delegate in the chamber had learned the same lesson. Humans didn't want to be conquerors. They wanted to be partners. But if partnership was impossible, they were perfectly capable of being something far more dangerous. The Nebulan delegate, speaking through his atmospheric suit, voiced what everyone was thinking. "We understand now that human restraint was not weakness, but strength. We ... we thank you for your patience." Jake smiled, and the expression was genuinely warm. "The Terran Federation values peace above all else. We always have. We hope we never again have to demonstrate what we value above peace." The implication was clear. There was something that humans valued more than peace: justice. And they had proven themselves capable of enforcing it on a galactic scale. The formal proceedings continued for several hours. But the real business had been conducted in those first few minutes. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and humanity had achieved what 3 centuries of diplomacy had failed to accomplish: a genuine respect and equal treatment. As the session concluded and delegates began filing out, the conversations were markedly different from the arrogant discussions that had once filled these halls. Species that had never given humans a second thought now discussed the importance of maintaining good relations with the Terran Federation. Former enemies spoke in hushed tones about the need to honor human territorial claims and trade agreements. Jake gathered his papers and prepared to leave, reflecting on the bitter irony of the situation. All they'd ever wanted was to be treated as equals. They'd tried asking nicely for 300 years. They'd filed complaint after complaint, requested mediation after mediation, appealed to every principle of justice and fairness that supposedly governed galactic civilization, and in the end, It had taken 40 minutes of unleashed violence to accomplish what 3 centuries of diplomacy could not. The galaxy had finally achieved the peace humanity had always wanted. It just took showing them what the alternative looked like. But perhaps the most important lesson wasn't about human military capability or the consequences of ignoring diplomatic warnings. The real lesson was about the power of patience combined with preparation. For 3 centuries, humanity had been building, learning, adapting, and preparing not for conquest, but for the day when they would no longer accept being treated as inferior. Every slight, every injustice, every act of discrimination had been carefully cataloged and prepared for. Every species' technology had been studied, their weaknesses identified, their tactics analyzed. Like compound interest, small actions repeated over time had built into overwhelming advantage. As Jake walked through the corridors toward his transport, he passed memorial walls that now honored the species that had been lost to tragic misunderstandings. The survivors maintained the fiction that what had happened was somehow accidental. The galaxy had simply misunderstood human capabilities, but Jake knew better. The galaxy had understood perfectly. They had simply chosen to believe that patience was weakness, that diplomacy was surrender, that a species asking for respect was somehow begging for scraps. They had learned otherwise. The universe had turned out only understood one language when push came to shove, and humans had always been fluent in violence. They had just preferred to speak in the language of peace. Now, as he prepared to return to Earth, Jake reflected on the compound effect of human patience. 3 centuries of diplomatic investment had finally paid the ultimate dividend, a galaxy that respected human rights not out of charity, but out of genuine understanding of the consequences of disrespect. The age of human niceness wasn't over. It had simply been redefined. Nice didn't mean weak. Nice meant choosing cooperation over domination, even when domination was within reach, and that, Jake realized, was the most human thing of all. The story of humanity's rise to galactic respect was complete. But like all compound growth, the effects would continue building for generations to come.